Fifth event in our program. This evening we're pleased to host a lecture by Trevor van Damme. Trevor holds a BA and MA in Greek and Roman Studies from the University of Victoria and obtained his PhD in Archaeology from UCLA in 2017. He currently holds a dual appointment as a Shirk Postdoctoral Fellow and a visiting assisting teaching professor at the University of Victoria. Trevor's research focuses on the contextualized study of ceramics from the late Bronze Age to the Classical period at Athens, at ancient Lithonia, and at our own institute's project at ancient Eleon, where he's worked since 2008. He's currently based in Athens working on his postdoctoral project, a monograph entitled Post-Glacial Athens, Technological Innovations and Social Transformations, which incorporates a complete restudy and final publication of the ceramic finds from the Mycenaean fountain on the north slope of the acropolis. Tonight, however, Trevor will speak about his work at Eleon in a lecture entitled A Late Archaic Destruction of Eleon and its Historical Implications.
For that very lovely introduction, and thank you also for the invitation to speak this evening. My talk this evening, as Jonathan mentioned, is going to focus not on my current research project in Athens, but rather some of the work that's been going on at the site of ancient Eleon, specifically with regard to the historical phases of the site, something that to a certain extent, haven't yet been presented as fully on account of the richness of the later prehistoric remains, or earlier prehistoric remains. All right. So the site of ancient Eleon is identified with the flat-topped limestone acropolis located on the outskirts of the modern Greek village of Arma. Located approximately equidistant between Thebes and the Euboean Gulf, the Acropolis was located at the juncture of two important routes in antiquity. And the one came out of Attica via Oropos and up the Asopus River Valley via Tanagra, ancient Tanagra here, and up through Eleon and on to Thebes. The other one came from the site of Chalkis, located here on the Euripus, through a narrow mountain pass over here, via the site of Mykalisos, the modern town of Ritsona, Arma, and on to Eleon before making its way to Thebes. During the periods when Thebes was politically active, in the area, Eleon particularly benefited from Theban hegemony over East Boeotia, whether it be in the Mycenaean or in the Archaic periods. But when Tanagra asserted greater autonomy over the area in the Classical and Roman periods, Eleon rapidly declined. My talk tonight examines the history of Eleon during its historical acme, specifically during the 6th century BC. This was a time when sites all across Boeotia display evidence for expansive cemeteries, probably indicative of considerable population growth, conspicuous consumption of imported pottery, and inter-site competition expressed through the construction of monumental architecture. Scholarship on the existence of a First Boeotian League in the 6th century is extensive. While it's largely beyond the scope of my talk tonight, it's clear that the 6th century was a period of extended prosperity, not just for Eleon, but for all Boeotians. A time when coinage marked with the Boeotian shield first began to be minted at several centers. Although this need not imply a centralized authority, it is indicative of a shared cultural identity emerging, particularly in central and eastern Boeotia. Indeed, it's around this same time, that is, towards the end of the 6th century BCE, that we see the first dedications by the Boeotians in common at Delphi, and the promulgation of a shared identity expressed through archaic poetry. And a lot of recent work has been done on this by Stephanie Larson and Barbara Kowalczyk. Alongside these developments, we might also place the creation of a shared ritual practice focused on a cult of Athena, perhaps even including the origins of the Pan-Boeotia festival at Coronea, and the development of an indigenous potting tradition, the so-called Boeotian kylixware, which to this day remains exceptional within Greece in terms of its tightly limited distribution within the traditional boundaries of Boeotia. And I would argue this isn't on account of a lack of beauty or external appeal, but rather tells us more about its almost exclusively ritual and or funerary function. Certainly before the Persian War, some form of Boeotian League does seem to be in existence. Herodotus makes reference to Boeotarchs, that is, the leaders of the Boeotians, who, under the later League, were elected from the various polis to serve as executives. Although some scholars have sought to read Herodotus as anachronistically referring to Boeotarchs in this passage, a recent epigraphic discovery from the Heracleonic Thebes, shown here, and tentatively dated to the early 5th century BC, demonstrates the existence of Boeotarchs around the time of the Persian Wars. And here you can make out the word Boeotarchos, Boeotarchontos, part of a dating formula utilizing a lost Boeotarch's name. By the 480s then, much of Boeotia seems to have come under Theban influence as part of the First Boeotian League, as was already argued by Robert Buck in his History of Boeotia. In the northwest, this appears to have been accomplished by force, as Schachter has discussed, based on Boeotian military dedications of military equipment to Zeus at Olympia, particularly a series featuring conflicts between both Thebes and Hyettus, and Thebes and or Komnenos. In the east and south, this appears to have been accomplished more through strategic alliances, the carrot rather than the stick. Theban expansionism under the guise of the Boeotian League appears to have been halted, however, by the emergent Athenian democracy. As recently discussed by Roy van Vink, it is likely that the emergent democracy was responsible for splitting Plataea away from the League as part of an aggressive push to demarcate the northern boundary of Attica. After 506 BC, it appears that Thebes lost control of most of the territory south of the Esopus, so here represented by this white line here. And so this area, the Parasopia around Plataea, was no longer part of the Boeotian League, but rather allied with Athens, and quasi-independent, at least at this period. This appears to be documented in a recently discovered series of bronze texts found in the Madis excavation at Thebes. And these texts record the sale of properties in the Parasopia by Thebans, and may therefore refer to the Theban withdrawal from this region as part of the terms ending that conflict. Likewise, we might look at new finds from the Madis plot, including this inscribed column that records a Boeotian version of the conflict between the Boeotians and the Athenians that ultimately led in the defeat of the Boeotians and Chalcidians in the same day. According to Herodotus, this was a devastating defeat and a glorious victory for the emergent democracy. Nonetheless, the fact that the Thebans were celebrating it in a temple in Thebes suggests that the defeat may not have been so resounding. At any event, it's clear that this marked a turning point both for the Boeotian League as well as for Atheno-Boeotian relations. It's during the period of 6th century prosperity and growth, then, that we must contextualize the site of ancient Eleon. Much of what we know about the history of Eleon must be derived from archaeology, as the site is rarely mentioned in historical sources outside of brief mentions in literature, such as the Catalogue of Ships, and as the place from which Odysseus stole, or Odysseus's boar's tusk helmet was stolen from in Book 10 of the Iliad. We get a little object biography about the helmet, and it's said to have originated in the well-built house of a minotaur at Eleon. In terms of geography, Strabo notes that Eleon, together with Arma, Mycalisos, and Phari, formed a tetrad of small towns referred to as the Tetrachomia. Mycalisos and Phari formed Strabo, whether referring to the political situation in the Hellenistic period or in his own time, indicates that at least later on, Eleon had fallen under the control of Tanagra. Although from what we can tell from our limited historical sources, in the time of the Persian War, the Tetrachomia seems to have fallen under the control of Thebes. So, since 2007, the Canadian Institute in Greece and the Ephorate of Boeotia have explored the site of ancient Eleon. First as part of a regional survey from 2007 to 2010, and since 2011 as an excavation project carried out on the acropolis of the site. The results indicate the acropolis has 3 periods of intensive use. So the early Mycenaean period from about 1800 to 1600, best represented by the bluestone structure, a monumental Mycenaean mortuary complex. The post-palatial period from about 1200 to 1100 BC, best represented by the remains of a thriving settlement, including multiple fairly elaborate domestic structures. And last but not least, the late Archaic to early Classical period, so say the mid-6th century to the mid-5th century BCE. And the finds from this period include votive material deposited in various bothroi or redeposited fills around the site. And we'll talk about those a little more this evening. Afterwards, the site appears to have been abandoned. There's not many finds on the Acropolis proper from the 4th century BCE onwards, until the site was reoccupied during the medieval period. And at that time, we have the construction of mortared watchtower and traces of a defensive wall built along the southern edge of the Acropolis, as well as numerous refuse pits that were dug along the eastern edge of the Acropolis. So within the area of our excavations, you can see one such pit right here that produced this 15th to 16th century glazed bowl. Beyond the Acropolis, however, the regional survey also revealed the presence of a lower town to the north and to the west of the Acropolis. In the exact same area where Heinrich Ulrichs, an early German traveler to the region, had observed the remains of walls that he thought defined a lower town. This includes a stretch of fortification wall preserving a rectangular tower that was documented to the west of the Acropolis, shown here in red. And here you can see an image of the wall itself, and this is the tower, and then you can see the course of the wall carrying on up the hill. Traces of a second tower were also preserved. The date of this wall, however, cannot be determined with certainty, as most of its elevation above foundation level has fallen away There's some indication that some of these blocks may belong to the upper elevation of the wall. And no excavation has yet occurred off of the acropolis, so it has also not been dated through excavation. The survey also revealed a number of cemeteries ringing the site of ancient Eleon. 3 of these were recorded by Fossey in his 1988 work, Topography and Population of Ancient Boeotia. These include a northern cemetery, a southern cemetery, and a possible cemetery beneath the modern town. This was based off of local informants, but it's unclear whether those informants were accurate in where the material came from. And we've been able to add nothing new to that. During the course of our survey, we did, however, locate an additional cemetery, the so-called West Cemetery, located here. Despite the seemingly large number of cemeteries at the site, none of these were in use at the same time, or at least only overlapped for small periods. The South Cemetery was in use primarily during the Mycenaean period, and consists exclusively of chamber tombs. Whereas the West Cemetery dates to the Archaic and early Classical periods, and the Northeast Cemetery appears to be classical in date. The most notable find from the Northeast Cemetery being this inscribed marble grave stele, recording the name of the deceased, Alpais. The only other major finds from the area of this cemetery include some classical figurine fragments that appear to be grave goods. So based on the distribution of survey pottery, the lower town extended at some point in the history of occupation far beyond the fortification wall that I just told you about to the west of the site. The area of most intensive use is highlighted here in red. Indeed, further to the northwest of the site, a survey in 2007 and 2009 discovered a series of rock piles in adjacent fields and containing numerous additional cut blocks. These are both orthogonal and rough-faced polygonal, and it seems possible, and perhaps even plausible, that these are the remains of a further city wall. Although it's seemingly impossible to associate this with the other known stretch, unless the former wall formed more of a deitichism rather than the exterior of the fortification. While we cannot be absolutely certain of this identification due to the lack of in situ foundations, it's worth pointing out that the wall bears a similar combination of blocks to the makeup of the classical walls of neighboring Tanagra. And you can see the approximate location of the wall highlighted here. So obviously these two walls would make a very strangely shaped lower town if they were part of the same system. So we may either have two phases of walling or one exterior wall and one deitichism. Strengthening the idea that this area marked an important boundary and perhaps also a gateway to the city was the discovery of numerous bases for grave stelae located just outside of the line of this purported wall. This area may therefore mark yet another cemetery, although the precise date and extent of such a cemetery remains unknown at present. It requires going back through the survey material, something we hope to accomplish later this summer, incidentally. The survey remains, therefore, when taken all together, document a thriving Archaic and Classical period settlement, which lay on either side of a small stream, shown here in blue, that emerged from springs at the base of the Acropolis. In the future, it's hoped that additional work on the survey material itself can shed further light on the changing fortunes of the settlement below the Acropolis, and perhaps get a better idea of the growth and development of the settlement over time. One of the most surprising developments to emerge from the Eastern Boeotia project survey was the limited amount of Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic material recovered from the Acropolis. When the distribution of this material is plotted, however, it reveals a distinct clustering of material in the immediate area of the wall. And sorry, this got a little washed out, but you can still make out that A44 is the darkest square. Unfortunately, this area has yet to be explored archaeologically, but the finds from the area include a variety of votive vessel types that you can see here, including miniature vessels, votive hydrii, black figure, perhaps with some sort of procession scene, also probably from a little hydria. We have the Boeotian Calathos pyxis, a distinctly ritual shape, and then black figure cups. All of this material that has been found in the region just behind the apex of the wall, shown here, finds close parallels with material found in an actual classical Bothros that we excavated on top of the Acropolis proper. So, very close parallels. As a survey tract, as survey tract A51, which also produced a concentration of classical material, wound up being the eastern gateway to the site, the so-called ramped entranceway that I will discuss further. It seems likely that should tract A44 be excavated, it's likely to reveal significant remains of the Archaic and Classical periods as well. Even without excavating the archaeological remains in survey tract A44, however, there is some evidence to suggest that a building of some importance once stood somewhere on the Acropolis. Since the inception of EBAP in 2007, scattered architectural terracottas from a Corinthian or Central Greek-style roof have been found in secondary deposits. So far, the remains consist of these two fragmentary ridge palmettes, and a number of pale slip pan tiles in a comparable fabric recovered from areas adjacent to the polygonal wall. They find good parallels stylistically with the second temple roof at Halai, dating to the later 6th century BC. The discovery of such roofing materials along the eastern edge of the Acropolis may also suggest that they were moved alongside the discarded votive materials that form the core of the discussion this evening. Although so far, furthermore, the construction of this hypothesized shrine or temple above the polygonal wall itself finds excellent parallels with other regional sanctuaries, including on the monumental scale at the site of Delphi, or on a more modest scale with the Temple of Athena at Haliartus, where a similar polygonal masonry defines the temenos. Both of these date to around the same period as the construction of the Eleon wall, that is late in the 6th century. So if we accept that there is evidence for some form of sanctuary on top of the Acropolis at Eleon, who might have been worshipped at such a hypothetical shrine. The only explicit mention of a cult at Eleon appears in the pseudo-Plutarchic work Lysionis Graecae, in which the author poses the question, how can it be that a river in Boeotia, nearby Eleon, is called the Scamander? To which he records that Deiomarchus, the son of Eleon, took part in the expedition against Troy, and after getting Glaucia, the daughter of Scamander, with child, he himself fell in the fighting against the Trojans. After the war was over, Heracles, a close friend of Deiomarchus, took Glaucia on board his fleet, and here I quote, when she gave birth to a son, he brought both the child and the mother and delivered them to Eleon in Boeotia. The child was named Scamander, and he became king of the country, and he named the Inachus River Scamander after himself, and the stream nearby he called Glaucia from his mother. The spring Acadusa he named after his wife, and from her he had the 3 daughters, whom even to this day they honor under the name the Maidens, the Parthenos. This passage is striking for suggesting the continuity of cult activity at the site into the Roman period, yet no such evidence has been found on the acropolis of ancient Eleon. A Roman period shrine to the so-called Maidens, if one existed, must have been located elsewhere. Given the obvious correlations between the present passage and the perennial spring, the Acadusa, at the base of the acropolis, which gives rise to a small stream, perhaps to be identified with the Glaucia, it seems plausible that the shrine to the so-called Maidens should be located somewhere along its course. Noteworthy in this regard is the fact that both Ulrichs and Fosse reported the remains of an ancient foundation beneath the small chapel that still stands just west of the source of the spring. Colonel Leake additionally records a sculptured tripod base along the very same stream bed. On the present evidence, therefore, it seems more likely that these maidens, if they did in fact receive a formal cult, should be located at these remains at the foot of the ancient acropolis, rather than on top, where Roman evidence is so far lacking. Indeed, it's tempting to link these watery maidens with the nymphs, who later sources credited as the source of the famous mantis, Bacchus of Eleon's, ravings. If this foundation is to be identified with a cult structure dedicated to the maidens, it seems unlikely then that the discarded votive material would have been hauled up on top of the acropolis to be used as construction debris. It seems far more likely that the debris originates from a cult structure on the acropolis proper. Beyond this single ancient account, however, our sources are remarkably silent about the site of Eleon and any associated cults. Unfortunately, our more recent excavations on the Acropolis have so far failed to produce a single graffito attesting to any god or goddess. Indeed, despite the fact that inscribed vessels are common at other Boeotian cult sites, they're conspicuously absent from the ramp deposits that we will discuss further. In 2017, however, my collaborator on the study of the pottery from Eleon, Bartek Lis, first noticed this sherd in the BSA study collection that is said to derive from the Acropolis of Eleon. The inscription is important because its scale and placement on the upper surface of the rim strongly suggest it's a votive graffito of a type paralleled by a number of vessels from across Boeotia. Here you can see the selection. Due to the casual nature of the sherd's acquisition, it's not possible to localize the sherd on the site with any precision, but it seems safe to assume the Acropolis would have been the focus of any visit to the site. As the preserved fragment is only one sherd from a much larger vessel, the inscription is highly fragmentary, with only 4 surviving characters. Nevertheless, they provide telling evidence for restoring the text. As preserved, the text appears complete at the right. To the left, the surface here has been chipped away, you can see, so it's possible that the inscription continued. The preserved signs that are complete, or are all complete, and they can be easily read, alpha, nu, alpha, iota, and a plausible restoration, therefore, would be Athanae, i.e. a dedication made to Athena. The spelling and restored text provided here ad exemplum is paralleled by a number of votive dedications to Athena made at Thebes, the Patoon near Cryphenia, Haliartus, and Thisbe. An additional find that may support this identification is an intact terracotta pendant depicting a gorgon in low relief, found in the ramped entrance to the site. Although no exact parallel for the terracotta has yet been found, Gorgonea, while rare, do appear at other Athena sanctuaries in Boeotia and Locris. At Helai, 2 such gorgon terracottas were found. One was a painted votive plaque, designed to be affixed to the temple wall by means of nails. You can see the remains of holes here. While the other may have been broken away from a larger statue made of terracotta depicting Athena. Meanwhile, from the site of Haliartus, the only gorgon iconography occurs on this rare mastoid cup form and depicts a very Attic-looking version of the gorgon, not so dissimilar from the Eleusis amphora. As regards the new find from Eleon, there's no question that our Gorgoneon is complete. The piercing of the present piece appears to be intended to allow it to be hung, whether from the neck of a devotee or a cult statue, perhaps, or hung from a peg on the wall of the shrine. When compared to Attic depictions of a similar period, it's tempting to think of the pendant meant to be hung around the neck of a simple votive cult statue, but that's perhaps a little whimsical. The hypothesis that there was in fact a cult to Athena on the Acropolis is strengthened by the large number of Athena cults identified across Boeotia and central Greece. Schacter identifies 12 of these. Of the cults, however, only the sanctuaries at Haliartus and Halai have been archaeologically explored and published in enough detail to make them particularly useful comparandum for the cult at ancient Eleon. But it is noteworthy that in both of these instances, the cult itself was located on the Acropolis of their respective sites. The material that I will be discussing in more detail tonight derives from the Acropolis proper. Here, beginning in 2011, we attempted to date the polygonal wall and to further expose the north tower of the polygonal wall, which was just barely visible at the time. In the course of reviewing the north tower, however, we discovered that it was part of a much more elaborate entranceway to the site. We additionally discovered that the ramp was in fact a series of ramps leading to a thrice modified gateway to the site. And you can see this particularly in the stratigraphy of the sectioned ramp. So here you can see an earlier angular stone chip ramp, as we call it, from these angular rocks and stone chips that make up its fill. And you have a very distinct lime plaster ramp. So that lies on top of, again, a very thick layer of fill. The levels can also be identified, as I said, in the entranceways to the site. So we have an early stone pivot placed here. It probably had a partner, however, a large medieval pit has swallowed it up. We have a second, probably late Archaic, monolithic, well, duolithic stone threshold. And last but not least, 2 later door jambs that seem to date to the classical period. And you can see these door jambs were set above the lime plaster surface. So we think the lime plaster surface goes with the fancy stone threshold, and we think the stone chip surface goes with this pivot stone doorway. Unfortunately, this purported classical entranceway was too high up, and all of the potential ramp surfaces associated with it are highly disturbed. And here again, you can just see the very well-preserved ramp levels. Each of these surfaces rests on a thick fill layer that we already saw of discarded votive materials. These ramps are extremely well preserved within the area of the gateway, as you can see in the present slide, except where they've been pierced by these medieval refuse pits. And unfortunately, those medieval refuse pits have done significant damage to some contexts. Particularly, one of the ramp pits contains dozens of intact classical figurines that we don't exactly know where they originally were. One potential interpretation is that they collapsed into the pit when it went out of use, or was the reason why the pit went out of use, as it is somewhat less defined than the other medieval pits. But it contained that nice salad bowl we saw at the beginning at its bottom, so it's clearly a medieval pit, not a classical votive Bothros. The angular chip ramp marks the earliest well-defined use of the eastern approach identified so far. It can be associated with a curved, roughly finished wall to the north on the basis of a similarly curving wheel mark preserved on the upper surface. The ramp's name, as I already mentioned, is derived from the stone fragments from which it's made up. And these are tentatively associated with the construction of this large rectangular terrace. So at this time, the entranceway consisted of curving wall and rectangular terrace that continues quite far down the eastern side of the site. It is very clearly a terrace wall. There's no interior face. The ceramic finds from the makeup of the surface and its underlying fill are highly fragmented, but can be mended with extreme patience and lots of coffee into near-complete vessels. The freshness of the breaks shows that they were either deposited shortly after breakage, if not actually further broken in the ramp by all the traffic driving on top of them. The vessels within the ramp are predominantly Boeotian Kylix ware, as you can see here, and they include a variety of shapes. So we have Kylix, Lacane, Cantharos. You can see a near identical one from Acropolis there. What is probably a crater. This is an absolutely huge vessel with the canonical bird decoration, and even a fiale shown here. Not shown is a calathos, very fragmentary, but with side cutouts. So this is one of the hallmarks of the early Boeotian Kylix ware, is the many different types of vessels that are made in this fabric and style. All of these vessels can be assigned to Percy Ur's class 1 of Boeotian Kylix ware. So this was a typology that he established at the site of Rutzona, so just across the way at ancient Makalissos. And Urs class 1, the earliest, is defined by these well-adhering paints, polychromy, and the use of these triangular filling motifs. And it dates to the first half of the 6th century BCE. Among the rare imports, we can see a black figure Lacanis in the messy manner of the Polos painter, as well as a late Corinthian Ribolos with this reserved rosette motif. And these agree very nicely with the Boeotian Kylix ware in terms of date. Also, within the same fills, there are numerous fragmentary glaze-painted papas-type figurines. So again, leaving no doubt that we're dealing with discarded votive materials, as well as a complete bronze fiale. After some time had elapsed, during which the surface of the ramp only gradually grew, a second major filling event took place. And this fill, which supports and in some cases merges into the lime plaster surface, consists of a densely packed mass of broken pottery fragments, including thousands of fragments of miniature vessels, interspersed with figurines, large roof tile fragments, charcoal, and stones. And so here you can see the chaotic situation upon excavation. So you have roof tiles, you have miniature vessel bases, here you have fragments of black figure cups, and here probably a chunk from a protome figure. The votive nature of the deposit continues, and as I said, there are a number of figurines. Many of these continue to be papas type, but now you can see instead of glaze painted, we have the application of this powdery slip, and then post-firing pigment applied to it. And so this is something that we're going to see also on the Boeotian Kylix ware, and is indicative of the transition from the 6th to the 5th century. In addition, there are many intact miniature vessels within the fill. So you can see one emerging here. These miniature vessels have been studied by a student of ours, Charlie Kurchak, who is at the University of Cincinnati. In addition to the pottery finds, other small finds include glass beads mirroring the dedicatory practices attested at the Cabirian just west of Thebes. The unity of this fill is attested by joints widely distributed along the east-west axis of the ramp. And so we find fragments of the same vessel originating up here to all the way down here in the ramp. So it's very clear that this material was all deposited at once and very quickly. Unlike the previous fill, in some instances we actually have intact vessels that seem to have been intentionally deposited in clusters. So these include, again, a large number of Boeotian Kylix ware vessels. They cluster along the northern edge of the ramp, and they may be indicative of low traffic areas. So the material on this side of the ramp is much more crushed. The Boeotian Kylix ware shows some development from the preceding phase. So we see exclusively linear and wavy band decoration now, although some of it is still what would be classified as Urs class 1, so with these well-adhering pigments. We now have the presence of a very powdery slip with post-firing pigments applied. And again, slightly washed out here, but what you'll notice is that this is the same type of painting that appears on the figurines. So again, there's this very close relationship between the Boeotian Kylix ware and the production of figurines, again attesting to this ritual production. We also see an increase in imports during this phase, a small increase. They're never very popular. And some of these may also just be faithful imitations rather than true imports. These include type C cup with conical lip here, a black figure pommet cup or cup skyphos here, and a Corinthian excavations with zigzag decoration on the shoulder. All of these find close parallels in graves from Acrythmia of the last 2 decades of the 6th and the 1st of the 5th centuries BCE. You can see some examples there. Among the most spectacular of the finds is a highly fragmented black figure type A cup found widely distributed throughout the fill. This piece can be assigned to Beasley's FP class on the basis of its handle zone decoration. The closest parallel to the present piece is the name vase of the group of roads, 11941. While the artist appears to be closely related, if not the same, there do seem to be some minor differences in the execution of the works. Ours has slightly more refined features, not to be biased, but there's some fine use of incision on the fingers. And this should place the present piece, at any rate, towards the end of the 6th century BC, and demonstrates the long lives of some of these votive vessels prior to their discard. One of the striking details about this vessel, as well as several others in the same deposit, are the presence of burn marks on some but not all the sherds, despite presenting clean joint edges. So you get the impression of a fairly rapid breakage and burning, the kind of thing you might expect in a destruction event by fire. Taken together with the circumstances of their finding, these vessels appear to document debris cleared from a building or group of buildings destroyed by fire. Remember, they're found with a lot of charcoal and broken up roof tiles, attesting to these buildings. I would argue that the date of this closely mirrors that of the Second Persian invasion of Greece in 480-479, and that this date is too coincidental, or too close to be coincidental. And indeed, support for this idea comes from the striking correspondence of vessel types within the deposit to those found in the Persian cleanup deposits in the Athenian Agora. Of particular importance are the aforementioned black gloss type C cup with concave lip, and diminutive black figure pommet cup, as well as Corinthian wares identified in both deposits, including cotyle with teardrop pattern in the handle zone and exelytra. Here I show you a second exelytron, so not the same one as before, but which closely parallels this example from Persian deposits in the Agora. And lastly, and most significant for the date, is the presence of this black figure, pommet lekaphos, which places the laying of the surface sometime after 490 BCE. Taken together, these vessels therefore support a destruction date within the same general time frame as the Persian destruction of Athens, and indeed the association with burnt debris and broken tiles also mimic the occurrence of discarded vessels with destruction debris in Athens. It remains then to determine what historical circumstances might have precipitated such a deposit at Eleon, despite ostensibly having taken the Persian side in this conflict. So the manner of destruction and the date of the encounter raise the possibility that the acropolis was sacked in the late Archaic period, a technique not unknown to the Persians elsewhere. As most will recall, however, Herodotus makes it quite clear that the Boeotians joined the Persians after Thermopylae, saying, and the Boeotians were compelled to join the Persian cause en masse, and Macedonian troops, having been sent by Alexander, secured their poleis by garrisoning them. And in this manner, they, the Macedonians, saved them, wishing to make clear to Xerxes that the Boeotians supported the Persian cause. Now, it's worth noting that this was not the most willing of arrangement. And although Herodotus wants to portray the Boeotians as, of course, turning over to the bad guys, the Persians, the fact that the Macedonians need to garrison the Boeotian cities certainly suggested that this cooperation was treated as temporary at best. So when and why would the Persian army have had the opportunity or the desire to destroy the acropolis of Eleon? A close reading of Herodotus suggests a perfect opportunity and highlights the impact of the Persian Wars on even those communities who aided and abetted the Persians. The moment in question takes place in Book 9, after Mardonius has withdrew from Attica to more friendly territory in Boeotia. According to Herodotus, the Boeotarchs sent guides to lead Mardonius out of Attica, first to Tanagra, where he spends the night. But what Herodotus records next is the key to my argument. For he says that Mardonius, after staying the night in Tanagra, turned his army towards Scolus, which was located to the west of Tanagra and just east of Thebes. So here's Scolus. One possible route, of course, would be to travel southward along the Taurus mountain range and get to Scolus. And most scholars have assumed, indeed, that's where the Persians went, because later on they built a camp here in preparation for Plataea. However, the Persians had a second option. They could also travel along the northern edge and also arrive at Scolus. And in this case, their route would have carried them directly past the territory of ancient Eleon, if not the site itself. The key to deciding which direction, in my opinion, lies in Herodotus' description that they wound up in Theban territory. And, sorry, to go back, remember that the area to the south here is all going to be considered the Parasopia and broken away from Thebes at this time. So the safer route for the Persian army, assuming that's what they were interested in, would have been to use the Souros Bridge as a defense and to move unseen from any scouts that were in the Parasopia, prying eyes, and travel here unseen. And it's what Herodotus says next that suggests this is the route indeed where they went. For he says that once arriving in Theban territory, thereupon, although the Thebans had joined the Persians, they razed their towns, Ekairetus Korus. This passage can only be understood, however, with reference to what has immediately transpired in Herodotus' book, in Herodotus' work, in the preceding book 8. And in book 8, this same expression, relying on the verb kairo, so to shave something to the ground, with the use of a korein, korus. And so to a reader of Herodotus, when we get to book 9 and we hear this expression yet again, we are recalling what has happened to the two neighbors of the Boeotians. So to the Phocians to the north, who had their temples and cities razed to the ground, and the Athenians, who also have had their city and temples razed to the ground. So the expression, when used in Book 9, we don't need the backstory that they razed their buildings and their temples to the ground, but rather it's assumed that you understand the loaded use of the term. One other key feature of this passage is his wording. Note that in Boeotia, he substitutes korus for korain. So the korain does seem to have more of the sense of like the territory of the area, the space around the main city. But in the case of Boeotia, we get the substitution of the word korus. And I think here the force of it really is the idea of small towns. And so what Herodotus is communicating is that there were a number of small towns in Theban territory that were destroyed by the Persians. And so it is tempting, of course, to associate these small towns with the tetrachomia, 4 small towns that existed at this time, part of Theban territory, and that could appropriately be termed korus. It is worth noting here that Perse-ur proposed on the basis of his excavations at the site of Ridzona, so located just here, that he associated with ancient Makalisos, that there was a rapid decline around 500 BC. Ur suggested that this was the result of the Athenian counteroffensive in 506 BC. But the redating of some of Ur's graves has shifted the chronology slightly lower, such that not only Eleon, but also perhaps Makalisos and even Arma could have found themselves in the Persian crossfire. After his discussion of the razing of Theban territory, Herodotus refocuses us on Persian preparations for the Battle of Plataea, including the establishment of a military camp to the south of Skolos. And you can see the acropolis of Skolos here, and it overlooks this pass connecting the Theban plain here with the Parasopia here. So I believe that is the location of Skolos that provides the key then for basically allowing this route to be possible. For after sacking the towns in the eastern Theban plain, the Persians simply crossed back into Parasopia at the site of Skolos. In support of this interpretation, I would introduce a later passage in Xenophon's Hellenica, where we find what is in essence a reverse Persian situation. Xenophon discusses how Agesilaus, the king of Sparta, entered Boeotian territory. Oh, sorry. So this would be the Persian route to Plataea. How Agesilaus entered Boeotian territory via Plataea, whereupon, I quote, he pretended that he was going to Thespiae first, and sending thither, gave orders that a market should be made ready, and that embassies should await him there, so that the Thebans guarded strongly the pass, leading them from Thespiae into their country. But on the following day at daybreak, after offering sacrifices, Agesilaus proceeded by the road to Ephrae, and after accomplishing in 1 day a 2 days' march for the army, he passed the line of the stockade at Skolos before the Thebans returned from keeping guard at the place where they had entered on the previous occasion. Having done this, he laid waste to the region to the east of the city of the Thebans, as far as the territory of the Tanagrans. So, exactly the reverse of what we're talking about here. As Fossey notes, the reference to wasting the countryside east of Thebes as far as Tanagra makes far the best sense if it means the eastern part of the very rich Theban plain itself. We can understand the passage by Skolos as the one which would bring the Parasopia into the Theban Tanagran plains to the north. Thus, we see all the same elements, platea, skolos, the raising of East Boeotia, as is preserved in Herodotus. I would argue that far from a coincidence, these passages both record practical military matters. For the Souris Ridge provided cover in both cases that allowed the enemy to go unseen, while at the same time allowing easy access between the two plains. While the extent of the Persian destruction at Eleon is yet to be fully ascertained, I hope that tonight's talk goes some way towards better understanding the horrors that war can bring to communities caught in the crossfire. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Are there questions, comments?
Thank you very much for the presentation. I was just wondering, what are the attestations for Eleon being at this location? What is the basis of identification of this site?
Yeah. So a lot of the identification of the toponym of Eleon is circumstantial, but we have two pieces of evidence that support the acropolis outside of modern Arma. And these are basically that we know from the Theban Linear B text that Eleon was an important Mycenaean center, a second order site to Thebes itself. And then we have some circumstantial evidence in terms of its being part of the Tetrachomii, so those four towns that lie between Tanagra and Thebes. And so taken together, the periods of occupation and the location seem to best fit the acropolis outside of Arma. But yes, it is to a certain extent at the present circumstantial, and it could be a different member of the Tetrachomia.
When you speak about the towns were raised, does that mean all the inhabitants are killed? Thus all the cemeteries?
Well, so there's no evidence for that, nor for mass burials of individuals after. Yeah, we don't know, right? Because Herodotus is so laconic in terms of his phrasing, it's kind of offhand. But I mean, if we think about, Herodotus's agenda, perhaps, he doesn't really want us to feel bad for the Boeotians, so he's a little bit glossing over that, their settlements too were destroyed, even though they had gone over to the Persian side. And I think it's that expression, even though they went over to the Persian side, that emphasizes that something bad has happened here. So although you could take Cairo to be more, they cut down trees, right? They just burnt the fields or something. It's that really strong wording of, although they had gone over to the Persian side, they punished them in the same way as Athens and Phocis that I just told you about in the last book.
So it's not known whether that includes destroying the towns, the fields, and
No.
the
evidence that I can use here is that in Book 8, it is clearly being used of leveling cities and temples in addition.
I notice that a lot of your conclusions and connections are tentative, as you say.
Yeah.
Are there future planned excavations that might substantiate some of your guesses or your suppositions, or even the points that you're making? Because some of them do seem very convincing, the way you put them all together. But I was just wondering if there are future planned excavations would substantiate your conclusions.
Yeah, so currently this summer will be our second study season after the first campaign of excavations, but we do hope to start a second campaign of excavations targeted on the basis of some geophysical work that we're going to do in the spring. And we hope one of those goals would be to test this tracked A44, right, to see if there are some sort of remains of a sanctuary on the acropolis.
In terms of Herodotus' text, I was just looking at Herodotus now, I was trying to locate the passage I had in mind. It would be worth thinking about other places earlier than those passages you mentioned in 8 and 9, where Herodotus talks about the destruction of cities. And one of those places is at the beginning of 6, where the Persians threaten the Ionians. If you revolt, this is what we're going to do. And they're very explicit about burning the cities, burning the temples, and dragging the girls to the Persian king. It's said more than once, and then when it actually happens, Herodotus then says, and so thus what the Persians had threatened to do, they actually went and did. And this very much structures the Ionian revolt. That's the backdrop for 8 and 9. Now, as I say, there are, as you know well, there are a number of different verbs that can be used for laying waste to things. I can't remember what the verbs are, but it is definitely the backdrop of what happens to cities when the Persians capture them. And that's worth thinking about in terms of your passages.
For sure, and you know, yeah, I probably didn't make the connection back as strongly as I should have, but I think also Herodotus is setting up this narrative when he tells us that the cities, the polis, were garrisoned. Both he claims to protect them from the Persians, but even in that instance, there's this idea that there's tension, and the Persian and the Thebans had kind of gone back and forth, right? They at first are kind of with the Persians, but then they fight for the Greeks anyway at Thermopylae, and then when that fails, they wind up going back to the Persians. And it's that kind of waffling that I think we then can understand why the Persians do what they do, because they know if they lose the Battle of Plataea, the point of this was to make a safety net, right? So that the Persians aren't going to be fighting fire on both sides.
Right, I understand that, Trevor, but what I'm trying to say is in terms of the way the narrative is constructed, the way Herodotus is writing, he has in mind not picking and choosing little bits and pieces the way we tend to use Herodotus, but you're going to read big sections of it.
Yeah.
And so what I think you need to do, so when he comes to talking 8 and 9, there's no reason to repeat things that he's talked about in great detail in 6. Because 6, remember that the Ionian revolt and the sending of the ships by the Athenians is the start of all the troubles for both the Greeks and the barbarians, says Herodotus. For him, that Ionian revolt makes a big turning shift. So when he's talking very laconically in 9 about laying waste to these cities, he doesn't need to go into details. He's already got into excruciating detail much earlier on. And that's the point that I'm trying to say, and that's what I'm saying about looking backwards.
Yeah.
That I think will help flesh out what the points you're trying to make here about 9.
For sure, and I completely agree. And thank you for the reference.
I'm sorry, I just can't come up with a full reference.
No.
Yeah, thank you for your interesting talk. I'm looking at the same kind of evidences in Eritrea for the same period. And one of the point is to define if we have maybe a Persian destruction or not, because we also are mentioned by Herodotus for an earlier destruction. And I have also deposits which are destructed and burned. But it's really difficult to decide if it's a destruction because of an attack or another thing. So I know that in my letters, for example, they have arrows in the destruction layers. We don't have any, or any other type of projectiles or anything. I guess they would have also maybe take them back because it's precious, metal is precious. Do you have anything else which could show that it's an attack and not just a destruction because of other events that could have happened in the same time?
Of course, because it's a secondary deposit, the answer is there's no in situ evidence to document that. Obviously, fire's involved, and there were structures that were destroyed alongside the material. But I hadn't even thought about the idea of arrows perhaps being linked to that, just because they occur in votive deposits, but there are arrowheads in the deposit.
Okay.
So it might be worth looking, at the specific types to see.
Or compare them with my lettuce, because I think they have a clear layers of destruction in 494 or something.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
But the deposit I'm looking at all over the site in Eritrea to compare it, and one of them is in the Agora, so it's not even like a ritual deposit or something like that, whereas I would say maybe on the acropolis, if you have ritual or votive deposition, they could also have been burned and broken, so I don't know how you can differentiate if it was that kind of process or an attack.
For sure. And I don't think, it can be entirely clear-cut at this point.
Yeah.
It's mainly, the coincidence with the date is striking, right?
Well,
How
we
many
have
things
one, yeah.
accidentally happen?
Well, and Trevor,
But,
your material, your imported pottery and the kind of debris you're getting look an awful lot like those destruction deposits, those cleanup deposits in the Agora.
Yeah, and that's the art, right?
Yeah.
It's just so close in
Those
time
types,
that
Lekythos particularly is very, very characteristic in the type C cups and.
Well, they're everywhere at this period. That's the thing.
Right, but the Agora, there's a very specific
Yeah,
set of
yeah.
profiles of those deposits, and having dug one of them that's not published in the 1993 article, has a very strong sense of what they're looking like. But what's interesting in those deposits, and this is also, Trevor, where your deposit is similar, is not only the contents that's in them, it's the way the deposits have been treated, that they're clearly being sealed off. And Shear emphasizes that in that 1993 article. And in some sense, what's so interesting about that ramp with the plaster surface is those things that you said, well, this looks almost like it's a deliberate deposit at that point. And that suggests that this isn't just because there was a fire, an inconvenient fire, because somebody's cooking fire got out of control.
Any more questions? One more.
I think a lot hinges on this Lekythos fragments you found. And it's obvious Class of Athens 5812 and Palmer 1, it's the same. But is it, because there's also Palmer 2 and 3 and they're more slender, is the profile really like bulging or?
I mean, it's very similar to the Agora example I showed. It's also the kind of diminutive size as well. It's not the full size.
But format like continue past 480.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. No.
You really have to look at the exact shape to be able to make the statements.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the lone latest datable object in the deposit as well, though. So, I mean, it would be extremely exceptional if there is one piece that is 2 decades earlier and then everything else is right around 500. But yeah, the point is taken for sure.
If there are no more questions, we can continue the discussion over some refreshments that you've served at the back. When you stand up, please fold your chairs and put them up against the shelves so we can space. Thank you, Trevor, very much.